And thank you very much for registering for this webinar. I'm pleased to say that we have people from all across the country, which is very exciting, from the New England region and beyond, all the way to the West Coast. So thank you, you far-flung folks, for joining us today. I'm really happy that we have such great registration subscription for this webinar, because this is truly information that has relevance nationally in terms of the crucial and immediate need to reduce our greenhouse emissions, and an insight into the incredible technology and resources that we have available to us today to help us get that job done. I am very pleased to introduce you to Susanna Hatch. I met Susanna through another webinar a few weeks ago and was so impressed by her presentation. I felt that she needed a broader audience, and so Susanna is with us today. Susanna is the Clean Energy Coalition Director for the Environmental League of Massachusetts, and she's also the regional lead of the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition. Just this week, the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts signed on as an endorser of this coalition, and we look forward to working with her and the rest of the coalition in advancing offshore wind in New England. Susanna will also be supporting the Global Warming Solutions Project, a network of Massachusetts environmental organizations dedicated to keeping the Commonwealth accountable to its climate goals. Prior to joining the Environmental League of Massachusetts team, Susanna worked in volunteer management at the Appalachian Mountain Club and served on AMC's Board of Directors, Strategic Visioning Committee, and Community Engagement and Analysis. That's important experience for the critical work that she's doing right now. So without further ado, I am going to ask Karen to turn the spotlight on to Susanna. Enjoy the webinar.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Lana. Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much for having me. It's really great to see so many folks that are interested in offshore wind and learning about this really important climate solution, both within New England, as is my focus, but also across the country. So I will try my best. My focus is on New England, but I'll try my best to make sure to give those of you that are from outside of New England a little bit more information about what the federal picture is and what offshore wind is looking like across the country as well. So as Lana said, I am the Clean Energy Coalition Director at the Environmental League of Massachusetts. And in my role at ELM, I'm also the regional lead for the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition, which we launched in August of last year. And we're very glad to have the League of Women Voters Massachusetts joining us in that effort. New England for Offshore Wind is a growing coalition of almost 100 organizations, including environmental advocacy organizations, academic and research institutions, justice and health organizations, businesses and business alliances, and labor unions. We believe that offshore wind is the single biggest lever that we can pull to reduce our emissions, address the climate crisis, meet our energy needs, and grow our economy simultaneously, all while protecting ratepayers, creating high-quality jobs, and improving public health by reducing pollution. We aim to drive governors and legislatures to support regional collaboration and more offshore wind procurements, building the political will to power every home in New England with responsibly developed offshore wind by the mid-2030s. And of course, we also work to ensure that offshore wind can come online in a timely and responsible manner. I'll go over the big picture of offshore wind and why we're focused on it, what the challenges are and what the coalition is pushing for. This is a very fast-moving industry, so hopefully the overview will be helpful, even though some of you may already be familiar with the subject. I will wrap up my presentation with a focus on our coalition's efforts in Massachusetts, just as a deep dive example on some of the things that we're working on. That will include an overview of our legislative efforts, which folks in other states may be interested in for their advocacy. So first, the why. From a climate perspective, offshore wind is likely to be the workhorse of our decarbonization efforts here in New England. We'll need significant new clean energy to come online in order to meet our goals. And we still have a lot of work to do in the near term, as you can see with this red dotted line, to ensure long-term success. Offshore wind is not the only piece of the puzzle. We'll need other renewables, including solar and storage, as well as energy efficiency to reach our goals. But offshore wind is the biggest piece of the renewable energy puzzle in New England, which I'll show you in a moment. Analyses, including this one from the Brattle Group, show that offshore wind will likely provide around 50% of our region's power generation by 2050. So the first graph that I was showing you is installed capacity, and the pie chart on the right is power generation, so how much power those resources are producing. Analyses by the states of Massachusetts and Connecticut showed similar findings for New England, that we'll need about 50% of our energy to come from offshore wind in order to reach net zero, which is the place that we have to get to in order to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. The technical potential of offshore wind off of New England is more than 10 times our current electricity demand. And New England is uncommonly well positioned to harness this potential. We have a dense population with high energy demand close to shores. You can see on the left, the wind off of our coast is stronger than almost anywhere in the world, as you can see in the middle, and it's strongest and most consistent in the winter when we will need it most for energy for heating in the future when we electrify our heating. And the shallow water on our continental shelf is ideal for building turbines. You can see it juts out pretty far. And even in the Gulf of Maine, where most offshore wind will need to be floating offshore wind turbines because of the depth of the water is still shallower than in other parts of the country, such as off of the west coast of the country, off of California, where the continental shelf just dives right into the ocean and is very, very, very deep. And finally, the economic potential of offshore wind in New England is astounding. This industry presents an enormous economic opportunity for our region. We're talking a potential $100 billion of private capital marshaled between now and 2050. So imagine what that could mean for our economy if we attracted some of that economic investment to our shores. A new industry of this scale has ripple effects throughout the economy, and those ripple effects will likely be beyond just our region as well. This will have to be a national supply chain to support such a large industry. And these benefits will be increased if policymakers within states make big offshore wind commitments to send strong signals to the industry that will drive economic investment in a local supply chain. The industry will also drive research and innovation of new technology, which will further drive down costs, which have already fallen 50 to 80% over the last few years in the US. Economic investments and the development of a robust supply chain would drive the cost of energy down even further. And of course, the economic investment from a new industry and the supply chain brings jobs, tens of thousands of jobs. And as I mentioned, while we are focused on this from a New England perspective and focused on building that pipeline within New England, a lot of these jobs will also come from states outside of the region to support manufacturing and construction of ships, for example. There are already folks at work in Texas doing that. So there will be opportunities across the country. Key challenges for offshore wind include building and operating wind farms while protecting the marine environment and wildlife, including avian species. We do have partners in our coalition that are very focused on this and believe that offshore wind is a key solution to climate change, which is an existential threat to wildlife. And they also believe that this resource can be developed responsibly in a way that minimizes impacts to the environment and to wildlife. Another key challenge is opposition from commercial fishermen. This is a sticky issue, but we believe that with proper stakeholder engagement and proper siting, offshore wind can coexist with existing ocean uses by being sited in areas with the least conflict. There was, I will note, also a study that was released in New York that found numerous opportunities for fishermen to participate in the offshore wind industry in ways that would supplement their income. So, an optimistic view is that coexistence could just be a baseline here, and that would be really exciting. Local opposition to siting and permitting is also an issue. This is an issue for all renewables as well as for transmission. So this is particularly an issue for interconnection, aka plugging in the resource into the grid and transmission. This one goes without saying for anyone that has been following this issue related to the New England Clean Energy Connect proposal in Maine. And as a nation, we really will need to figure out this issue if we are going to build out a clean energy system and expand the grid to support it. There have been several studies, including one by Princeton University, that show that we will need to expand our transmission grid, our national transmission grid, by 2 or 3 times in order to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change by bringing on enough clean energy for our energy supply. And finally, another challenge of offshore wind is ensuring equitable economic benefits, particularly in Massachusetts, though I would not be surprised if this is true elsewhere. We do not have a great track record of expanding new industries and ensuring economic benefits are shared beyond wealthy white investors. So ensuring that economic benefits are shared by all is of utmost importance to the sustainable growth of this industry and our local economy, and to ensure that we are building a new clean energy future that has equitable economic opportunity and can provide jobs and business opportunities for all people in the economy. So that's the why, as well as the challenges. So where are we now? One important thing to know is that all of the movement on offshore wind in the United States is happening within the context of a booming global market. Offshore wind is not a new technology. Those of you that have traveled to some Northern European countries might be very familiar with this. The first project was installed off of Denmark in 1991. So 30 years ago. There are over 5,000 turbines, if not 5,500 at this point, installed in Europe. And Asia has many as well and is ramping up very quickly, particularly in China. The US, meanwhile, has 2 turbines, 2 in federal waters and 5 in state waters off of Rhode Island, off of Block Island. So we've got a really long way to go to catch up and compete in this global industry. New England states were first movers on offshore wind in the United States. Massachusetts was the first state that had legislation that required the state to procure offshore wind energy. And as you can see, several states have targets for offshore wind, and several have signed contracts with offshore wind developers for projects. It's important to note that while we are operating within a competitive global industry, we're also competing for resources, investments, and economic benefits within the United States as well. States to our south, particularly New York and New Jersey, have really set strong targets for offshore wind and economic development provisions to attract the industry to their states, as you can see in this table, and have been fairly successful at dragging that center of gravity of the industry towards their shores. We're focused on a regional context within our coalition advocacy, because we believe that collaboration will not just improve project outcomes and ensure long-term success, but also to ensure that we maintain leadership in this industry and secure its promise in our region so that we can drive a green and just recovery. Regional collaboration in New England would drive economies of scale and lower prices, and would also allow us to address common challenges such as energy supply, transmission, equity, wildlife protection, and stakeholder engagement. It's also worth mentioning here that the last year has seen a lot of really impressive activity at the federal level on offshore wind, and I'm happy to talk about this more later. But in the spring, the federal government approved the first large-scale offshore wind project, which is being contracted by Massachusetts. It's called Vineyard Wind 1, I should say. And then they also set an ambitious target, an ambitious nationwide target to deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. To give those of you on the call that are not familiar with megawatts and gigawatts a little bit of a reference for scale, the New England grid, the entire New England grid is roughly 30 gigawatts. So it's an enormous amount of offshore wind that would really be able to give us a significant amount of clean energy across the country. They also, a couple of weeks ago, announced a proactive strategy for leasing in the United States waters, both on the East Coast and the West Coast. Offshore wind is available near where 80% of the country's population is. So it's a really prime clean energy resource because it's close to where the demand for power is. That leasing process, they announced that they were going to be pursuing lease sales in federal waters for offshore wind projects in seven different areas, including off of California, Oregon, Gulf of Mexico, the Carolinas, etc. So that was very exciting, and up till now they have been fairly reactive in their leasing process. So this allows stakeholders a little bit more clarity as to where the federal government is going and what timeline they are operating under. That being said, it's a very long process. There are a lot of opportunities for public engagement and comments, and will likely take quite a while to even designate where offshore wind could go. And after that, there is a long permitting process before an offshore wind project can even be reviewed and approved and built. So the leasing is the first step, which is exciting, which is why it's exciting that the federal government is moving forward. Back to the coalition. That was a little federal tangent there. Our vision is that if we succeed in driving our goals as a coalition, that we would see enormous benefits to the region, to our communities, and to the environment. New England would be at the forefront of the industry, providing tens of thousands of high-quality jobs to the region. Clean energy could outcompete fossil fuels and force dirty power plants to close, while also reducing pollution and providing job transition opportunities. It's really of utmost importance that we make sure that a transition is finding job transition opportunities that are high quality for folks that are in the fossil fuel industry. Offshore wind would also serve as the backbone of renewable energy supply needed to electrify transportation and heating systems. And our region could serve as the leading example in how to successfully and responsibly develop offshore wind and pursue an equitable roadmap towards carbon neutrality. As the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition works towards enhanced regional collaboration and commitments to offshore wind power, our advocacy and actions are rooted in 4 core values. So every single thing that we do, every decision we make is guided by these values. Respect and responsibility is the first. Science-based decision-making, equity, and economic justice. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is a very broad-based coalition with members from all New England states, including environmental NGOs, environmental and social justice organizations, labor unions, businesses and business associations, and academic and research institutions. The regional coalition is led by a steering committee that is comprised of state committee chairs and sector leads, such as labor and business and wildlife focused organizations. And those state leads head up state level advocacy efforts through state committees to ensure that state level efforts are supporting the coalition priorities, while also recognizing that there are unique challenges in each state. Folks that are from outside of New England may be surprised at how different the states in New England are, but there are certainly different challenges in each state, even though we are in a very small region. And I will finish my presentation with just a little bit of a deep dive into the Massachusetts legislation that we have been working towards, since I know most of the participants here tonight are from Massachusetts and may be interested in getting involved in this. This could also serve as inspiration for other states that don't have very detailed offshore wind legislation, so you can be familiar with what kind of opportunities there are to push forward those core values that I mentioned. So you know, in Massachusetts, like I said, all state committees are working on supporting the coalition priorities. So we've been working on supporting our regional collaboration advocacy, and then there's also a second track of making sure that that the state pursues the next offshore wind projects in a responsible way. The state issued a solicitation this spring and had bids submitted by offshore wind companies in September. And we advocated in that process for the state to include things that were aligned with our core values, including strong language on diversity and inclusion requirements for the industry, as well as environmental justice language and wildlife provisions. And then the other track of our advocacy is this legislation. We filed a bill that is H3302, and it has a whole bunch of different important pieces in it that are important to our advocacy as a coalition. I'm just going to highlight a couple of these. Number 4, you can see that there are provisions for wildlife protection. This section both requires offshore wind companies to give a minimum amount of money towards regional research and monitoring, as well as creates formalized stakeholder processes and working groups for people that are part of the fishing community, as well as part of the wildlife environmental community to weigh in and work with the state on making sure that offshore wind is developed responsibly. We also have sections that drive funding towards research and workforce development, as well as enforce labor standards and codifies that economic inclusion language that I mentioned that we succeeded in getting in the solicitation for the next project. It also includes an additional provision to allow for municipalities and private entities to procure offshore wind and to have those projects be a part of the state procurement, so that they are additional. Say the state procures 800 megawatts and a private business wants to procure 50. It's very hard to build an offshore wind farm at this point that is a very small scale. So allowing private procurements to be part of those larger procurements would be additional and make sure that we're bringing more clean energy to the grid. So that's our bill. The status of the bill, just to give folks a quick update, offshore wind is one of the top priorities of the Speaker of the House in Massachusetts. Those of you that were on the day on the Hill yesterday, I think it was, would have heard this in his remarks. He is determined to move it forward. What we've been hearing is before the end of the year, so within the next couple of weeks. And they recently released a report from the Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy Committee on the state of offshore wind in Massachusetts. And that report contained recommendations that will serve as the foundation of a House bill that we expect to be voted on before the end of the year. Many of our provisions that were in H3302 were included in that bill. So were included in the recommendation. So we were very excited to see to see those recommendations and to see this moving forward. And they also had additional provisions that were very exciting, including quite a high level of investment. The governor had proposed $750 million towards this industry, and the legislature was pretty much in line with that. So that would be a very exciting piece of legislation to kind of jumpstart, to really help jumpstart the industry in the way that Massachusetts really jumpstarted the biotech industry in the last decade. So we're expecting them to move on that bill in the next couple of weeks, though time is of the essence, and we will be continuing to monitor this and supporting all of those provisions that were included, while also advocating for those that are missing to be included in the final bill through amendments. And then, of course, once it passes the House, we'll move on to the Senate. So there will be a lot of opportunity for folks to engage in advocacy on the Senate side in the next year, which will be probably the best strategy for grassroots folks to really help the Senate hear that people really support this and that they should move quickly, because up till now it has been primarily a House priority in Massachusetts. So lots of opportunity for engagement there in the next year. I have challenges and opposition here on the slide, so I should just do that briefly before I move to my next thing. There are some pieces of the bill that many players do not like. Some of the challenges for our particular bill are on including those sections that have not been included, particularly the remunerations piece. This is essentially a kickback to utilities that is codified in Massachusetts offshore wind legislation that ensures that the utilities will get up to 2.75% of project costs in order to basically take on the risk of these projects. And these projects are fully supported by ratepayer funds, so it's not a risky proposition. However, it's probably not surprising to hear that it's going to be a very hard thing to take out of legislation because of the power of the utilities in our region. And then other challenges that I would foresee are challenges from existing fossil fuel generators that see offshore wind as a threat to their business. But otherwise, at least in the House, it's looking very good, and will likely move forward in the near future, if not in the next couple of weeks, hopefully early 2022. So we're very excited about that. And this is my last slide, and then I'm looking forward to questions and discussion with all of you and with Lana moderating. So I did mention the ways that folks can weigh in on the Massachusetts offshore wind bill for those of you that are in Mass. I expect a lot of opportunities for that in the next year with the Senate. Anywhere you are, no matter where you are in the country, actions that you can take include writing letters to the editor, writing op-eds. It's really important to make sure that we're keeping the drumbeat across the country about why this clean energy resource is so important. Again, it's not the only piece of the puzzle, but it's really huge given its potential power generation and where it is near a lot of the population. So that's a really important thing to do, and any individual can write into their local paper to submit an op-ed or a letter to the editor. So that's a great action to take. There are also some federal things that are going to be happening even in the near term. So for those of you that want to raise your voice at a federal hearing, there will be hearings happening starting next week, starting on the 10th of November, for the Mayflower Wind project, which part of which is going to be contracted by Massachusetts. Those hearings, I believe, are taking place on the 10th, the 15th, and the 18th of November, where the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management staff members will take the time to present information about the project, including detailed environmental aspect of the project. And essentially what they're going to be doing is kicking off a very detailed environmental review, which is a 2-year, if not more, if not longer process. So it's a great opportunity for folks to hear from the experts, ask questions, and then also there are opportunities for public comments within those hearings. So you can express why offshore wind is important and hopefully support their efforts to move forward to do an environmental review, which, as I mentioned, is a very long process. There are also a lot of intergovernmental regional meetings that are taking place. And I believe one just was held off of Oregon for potential leasing in that area. There's also one scheduled or going to be happening soon for the Gulf of Mexico. And I believe there will be one for the Carolinas as well. And then we're also expecting an intergovernmental task force meeting in the Gulf of Maine, hopefully in early 2022. So those meetings, the public is not allowed to speak at those meetings, but we are allowed to attend. Participants of those meetings that can contribute are all state policymakers. So if you are very passionate about offshore wind and want to make sure that something is covered, or that some particular issue is raised and addressed, one other thing that you can do is, when one of these intergovernmental regional meetings are coming up, is you can reach out to some of your state policymakers to make sure that they have representatives going and expressing your concerns. So mayors, for example, that are on the coast will probably be invited, as well as key legislators and governor's administration staff members. So yeah, lots of different things that you can do. That's not an exhaustive list, but just examples of things, of actions that you can take within the next months and year. And I will stop sharing my screen so that we can have time for Q&A.
Great. Well, thank you, Susanna. You know, I heard you present a couple of weeks ago, and this time around I heard things I didn't hear the last time. So that's always a benefit of kind of revisiting the material. And thank you. I think I really appreciate your clarity and also your honesty with regard to what the issues are. We have some great questions in the queue. Appreciate everyone's patience in waiting for those questions to be asked after the presentation. I'm going to take advantage of the moderator's position here to ask you two quick ones. I hope they're quick. You mentioned the opposition of fishermen, and it was my understanding that the wind farm installation in Rhode Island, there was some initial opposition from fishermen or concern, but it turned out that those concerns really, they did not see any kind of major impact on their fishing stocks. Am I incorrect in that? I thought that's what I had read or heard.
You are not incorrect. It's important to note that Rhode Island did a really incredible job at doing site assessment and making sure to site those offshore wind turbines in an area that did have least conflict. Mm-hmm. However, it's actually been for recreational fishermen, especially, it's actually been a real boon to their businesses and to fishing, because a lot of the draw for recreational fishermen is obviously going where there are structures and where there are a lot of fish, and the foundations of those turbines have created vertical reefs that have created additional environment for fish to thrive in. So recreational fishermen, at least, have been really love fishing around there and are big fans of the fact that it has actually kind of built up the fishing stock in the area. I think there are concerns with the larger scale, because this wind energy area off of Massachusetts and Rhode Island for commercial leases is much bigger. But there have been really important compromises that have been made, as well as, you know, those leased areas being sited in areas that that do have the least conflict for fishing. That is why they were selected. But the developers have also agreed to space the turbines apart on a very on a grid pattern of 1 nautical mile apart between each turbine, which is the furthest apart that they have been. So there have been a lot of actions that have been taken to hopefully minimize those impacts. But yes, briefly, you were correct about what has been found at the Rhode Island turbines, and we hope that we might see additional positive impacts like that with these larger commercial scale projects.
So it sounds like having stakeholders at the table and also really taking siting issues seriously is an important ingredient to success for these projects.
Definitely, I would arguably one of the most important steps is figuring out where it goes. And that is crucial for both fishing as well as for the environment and for wildlife. Making sure that we're citing these things where you'll have the least environmental impact is really huge. And there are a whole bunch of other concerns as well, like military, and that's particularly true in California, and shipping lanes and all of that. So it's a very complicated process. And I don't envy the task.
So talking about the complications, you mentioned when you're discussing the federal things that were happening, federal actions, you talked about a lengthy process, and right away I started thinking about 2030 and the need to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030, which is that is a very ambitious target, but it's a really important one. Do you feel that these projects, many of them will be far enough along to really help us meet that kind of reduction target, the 2030?
Yeah, you're right that scientists have said that we'll need to get to 50% greenhouse gas reductions by 2030, and that is also a goal within the state of Massachusetts as well as other states. Right. The 30 gigawatt target for the country, many will say, is really quite ambitious, to have all of those turbines spinning by 2030 and producing energy. However, the important thing to note is that states have been driving this process up till now, as you saw in the table that I presented at the beginning of my presentation. I'm going to look at it to refresh my memory. States up and down the East Coast have targets of 40 gigawatts by 2035 or 2040. So it might be a hard goal to reach, but it's not impossible. And I think the really key ingredient here that will make it happen is federal government leadership and partnership with these states to make that happen. And so the decision on releasing a roadmap on leasing across the country, 7 new lease sales by 2025, that's a key step. And then they're trying to work really hard to streamline the permitting process as well. So the first project, Vineyard Wind, standard protocol is that this environmental review process is about 2 years at least. Of course, there were some kind of political roadblocks to that project in 2020. And so that actually had a much longer runway than some other projects. And so we're hoping to see a little bit more of a standardized process to both clarify expectations for all stakeholders, but to also help ensure that we can reach that goal. So it might be a stretch, but it's certainly possible based on a lot of the legislation that has already been put in place by states that really want to make sure that they're also reaching those targets.
And we have experience to build on. The main thing is we're starting, and we just need to keep the pedal to the metal on this effort. So I don't want to take any more of the time with my questions. I'm going to go to some of the questions that are in the Q&A, and I'm going to give you, let's see. Alrighty. One person is wondering, Bob is wondering about the impact on offshore wind, given Maine's ballot question yesterday to ban the Massachusetts power line to bring Canadian hydro to our state, possible expansion.
Yeah, it's certainly, it's not directly related, but as I mentioned, the Canadian hydro power line is coming from Hydro Quebec for hydropower for Massachusetts. But as I mentioned in my presentation, transmission really is going to be a key issue, you know, whether or not you're thinking about this New England Clean Energy Connect project. We're really going to have to figure it out. It's not an issue that is unique to Maine. There's a lot of opposition to siting of all sorts of renewable infrastructure, including transmission, across the country. And so it's going to be a challenge. However, there have been a lot of conversations that are really promising. For example, the 6 New England states hosted several technical conferences last year. It might have been 2020, and my sense of time is a little bit blurred since the pandemic started. But in the recent past, the 6 New England states hosted technical conferences, including a conference on transmission planning. And so I think a key here is, which is what the states are pushing for, is to make sure that we have a really robust long-term planning process, so that we all understand the bigger picture and have a more a better understanding as to what's needed to reach that 2050 goal. Right now, a lot of the transmission planning that has been happening is a little bit more of like a Band-Aid approach, where when you need upgrades, they're very locally focused. So for example, offshore wind coming in on the Cape, they've been talking about what upgrades need to happen on the Cape in order to get the power off the Cape. Whereas if you think about it, take it up a level and think about it at a higher level, it may help folks understand the bigger picture of what's needed, but it may also minimize unnecessary construction. So that's really important. That being said, it is going to be, you know, the next step once we fill up the lease areas in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. The next step will likely be the Gulf of Maine for New England. And most of the power demand in New England is in Massachusetts and Connecticut. So getting the power from there to here is going to be a challenge. And it's, you know, a conversation that we need to start now, because if we are going to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, we need transmission. That's really, really key. So that was a very long answer to your question, Bob, but it's a fabulous question. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, let's see here. A lot of questions. How well will Boston, New Bedford compete with New York Harbor, Norfolk, Portsmouth, Newport News, and other Atlantic coast ports for offshore wind related manufacturing, parts, assembly related jobs? That's from Clem, who lives in Wilmington, Delaware. Thank you.
Nice. Great question. You did hear me say in my presentation that, you know, all of these states are kind of racing to be leaders in this industry and to get kind of the biggest economic piece of the pie that they can. That being said, we're going to need this kind of infrastructure up and down the coast. So everyone will be part of this industry. Just as to give you an example of New England, because that's what I'm focused on. If you're familiar with it, we're going to need a whole constellation of ports up and down the coast. So we have New Bedford in Massachusetts. We also have Somerset. We also have Salem in Massachusetts. And then if you go north, Portsmouth, New Hampshire is likely to be really crucial, Searsport, Maine. And then of course, going south, Providence, Rhode Island, Bridgeport, Connecticut. We're gonna need infrastructure in all of these different places. And the reason being, and that includes New Jersey, that includes New York, you know, there are gonna be ports up and down the coast. The reason being that unlike in some parts of Europe, where they have some very large plots of public land on the coast that can serve as kind of like a one-stop shop hub for offshore wind that includes manufacturing and staging and assembling and all sorts of stuff. We don't have giant swaths of land next to as industrial port sites typically in the United States. So we're going to have a whole bunch of little ones to fill different needs. So one port might serve the need of staging, where you're going to have all the parts lined up, and laid out before they're loaded onto ships. Another one might be more focused on manufacturing, such as the Hampton Roads, or maybe it was Portsmouth, a port area in Virginia that was announced is going to have a blade factory that was announced last week. So yes, there will be competition. That goes without saying. And New Bedford is very well positioned because it's the first purpose-built offshore wind port in the country. But that being said, there's going to be action everywhere. So great question.
Well, we have about 15 questions left, so, and 10 minutes left. So this is.
I'll be quicker.
Okay. Clem, I'm going to go to someone who hasn't had a question asked yet. Florence from the Cape has a specific local question around Fishermen's Alliance. She has asked if if your organization has spoken with the Fishermen's Alliance that is housed in Chatham. She says that they are a very important advocacy group on the Cape.
Great question. I am one person, so I have not spoken to everybody. We do have some members that are on the Cape that I am sure have spoken to that group. But I'm going to write that down because that's a really great flag and something that I will follow up on. Okay,
a question from, whoops, this keeps jumping around. Sorry guys, wait, give me a moment here. All right, come on, Lana. All right, well, I'm going to go to one I can see. How much storage will be needed if the expanded vision for offshore wind is achieved? Can we answer that question?
I don't have that number off the top of my head. The Bradall Group study graph, actually, maybe I can just look at that as just one example, they said 28 gigawatts. That's one study. I don't know, I'm sure there are a whole bunch of different analyses, but we're definitely going to need storage to store energy 4 times when energy is needed, if energy is being produced at times of low electricity demand.
Got a very political question here from Deborah. Any chance you'll name who the problematic senators are likely to be? So letters to the editor and op-eds can be launched in their districts.
That's a great question. I don't know if I want to answer that directly since I know this is going to be posted online. But maybe I can get contact information. I mean, I think really in Massachusetts, if that's where the question is coming from, the issue is not whether or not people support offshore wind really in Massachusetts, in the House and the Senate. It's more the details that people are concerned about. And that some senators or House members might be against. So for example, one thing that I can flag is that there are some senators that are concerned with putting more emphasis on economic development within the evaluation process of offshore wind projects. Whether it's that they think the cost is going to go up or that the benefits aren't going to reach their districts. So that's one thing that's of concern. There was also concern about the House bill removing what we colloquially call the price cap, which means that every single subsequent Massachusetts offshore wind project needs to be cheaper than the last, which causes a lot of problems for storage, for transmission, things like that. There is concern from some senators, and they're using kind of ratepayer costs as one of their key concerns. But as we all know from just life experience, the cheapest thing is not always the best thing and not always the best long-term plan. So those are some things that have been concerned that I suggest you Google to see what you can find and see if your local senator or legislator is interested in that.
Right. And we already know the where some of the opposition around the price cap has come because some senators are pretty vocal about their feelings on this. So there is a way, and there's always calling them and asking them directly as a constituent. All right, we have a question from Joseph. Joseph is from Southern Oregon. What benefits have you identified for wildlife and fisheries, kelp, etc.? What are the risks to the platforms from earthquake and tsunami? We expect the big one any day. What risk from hurricanes?
Oof, yeah, big one. That keeps me up at night sometimes thinking about friends that live out there as well. I am not an expert on earthquakes and everything and their effects on offshore wind. So I'm not sure if I'm the best person to answer that. However, I can say that there are a lot of places in the Pacific that are really interested in this technology and are moving forward on it, and they have equally, high risks of earthquakes and tsunamis, if not higher. So I would suspect that means that they're a pretty sure thing for those kinds of things. Just to look at your question, to dig into some of these things for kelp, I know that there's a lot of interest in kelp for aquaculture. There have been some folks that have been pointing at offshore wind as being a really great opportunity to house aquaculture as well, to be kind of a multi-purpose area. So there could be huge benefits there, but it's not something that we have seen yet in the US. So yeah, good question. And then as far as hurricanes go, they are very resilient up to a certain and can produce power up to a certain speed. Once the wind gets beyond a certain speed, I don't know the number off the top of my head, they feather the blades so that they stop moving, and so they're very able to withstand those. But if the wind gets too high, they will stop producing power.
And we know from the Texas experience that the traditional fossil fuel facilities really had a difficult time with some of the weather that was thrown at them in Texas a while ago. So got a quick question. I think it's a quick answer. Where are the windmills in your images? People would like to know where they're from.
Great question. Some of them are probably Europe. I'm scanning this. I think most of the other images in here are the Block Island Wind Farm off of Rhode Island, because those are that was the first one.
A question about activity happening off the Canadian East Coast.
I haven't heard of anything, any offshore wind discussions off of the Canadian East Coast, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's being talked about, but I haven't heard anything.
Okay, Ray asks about the impact on whales and the best place to learn about impact on whales. We have a major concern on our coast about right whales and endangerment of right whales. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, great question. One organization that I will point you to that I encourage you to look into their materials is the National Wildlife Federation. They're a partner of the coalition, a very close partner of mine. They sit on the steering committee of the coalition. They have a lot of resources and have been doing a lot of work alongside other whale and wildlife focused organizations. So in terms of impacts, I think there are a few different risks that are not unique to offshore wind. Particularly on the East Coast, we have concerns about the North Atlantic right whale. It is a critically endangered species, and I think there are something like 360 left or something in the world. The number changed recently, so that's why I don't remember it off the top of my head. That the risks that are posed to them are ship strikes, which is not unique to offshore wind. Ship strikes happen all over, from shipping, from commercial boats, etc. Entanglement from fishing gear, and noise disturbances. They use noise to be able to navigate, to be able to communicate. So there are a bunch of different measures that offshore wind developers can take, and some projects have committed to these. One is not constructing when they're in the area. They have a very predictable is probably the wrong word, but like regular migration pattern from around Florida up to Canada. And so there are certain times of year that you just shouldn't even do any construction, because it's when there's going to be a lot of them. And Vineyard Wind has agreed to that. There are also that you can also have monitoring during construction, so that if a whale is seen, all construction can stop. I think they've also agreed to that. And then there's also a whole bunch of measures that can be taken to minimize the noise. One fun thing that I love picturing is that there's technology that you can use a bubble curtain to minimize the sound coming from pile driving, which I think is so cool. So there are a lot of things that can be done. I would recommend that you go and look at NWS resources because they have been advocating for offshore wind for almost a decade, I think, if not longer, and have a very deep expertise in this, much deeper than I do.
Thank you. So we're coming very close to the end of this time period for the webinar, and 2 minutes left. So I think at this point, I'm going to ask you, Susanna, would you be willing, if we sent you some of the remaining questions, would you be willing to try and respond in writing, and we could give those answers to the people who are asking? There's still some really good questions that haven't been asked yet, and it'd be great if we could do that. There aren't that many, there are only 4, but
I'd be happy to, yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I think that we really do need to close for now. Karen, are you able to capture those questions so that we can be sure to get them?
I'm not sure, and I'm not sure how Susanna would know how to get in touch with people.
Well, I was thinking we could send it to the folks who registered for the.
Okay.
You know what? I am going to take a photograph of the remaining questions, and we'll try it that way. So bear with me for 20 more seconds. I know I've often been one of those people whose question never got answered, and it's frustrating. So we're going to do our best, everyone. So, well, I think with that, I just want to thank you, Susanna, for the time and thought you put into your presentation and also answering the questions. It's clear that there's a lot of interest in this, and we're going to move forward. And I also want to mention to you folks who are in Massachusetts that the League is a strong supporter of H3302, NS 2148, the offshore wind bill that Susanna was referring to. So we will let Massachusetts folks know via action alert or other means when you can take action to help move this bill forward, or at least the critical elements in the bill. So unless there's anything else at this point, I'd like to thank you again, Susanna, and thank all of the registrants who participated and stayed with us to the end. And keep in touch. You can go to our League website, lwvma.org, and you will see information under the Environmental Action and Advocacy Committee webpage. We will capture the recording and other information, links, etc., that you can all refer to. And again, that's it. Thank you very, very much. Bye.
Thanks for having me.